Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to the Occult Explorers. I'm your hostess, Snappy, and I'm joined as always by my good friend and co-host, Dion. How's it going, Dion?
Hey, glad to be here. Good morning.
Right? Good morning. We're going bright and early. This is kind of a bit crazy for us, but we wanted to do this because we were inspired by the Muse, and Dion had some really interesting stuff to share. So if you guys remember from part 2 of our last episode we were looking at this continuing exploration into Mormonism and its related ideas, and specifically a lot of the religious philosophy and ideas that were coming out of New England. Well, you kept finding more stuff, right, Dion? And a lot of the really cool stuff you were finding isn't directly related to Mormonism, but it's of that world, it's of that milieu, right? And you were telling me it helps really explain Joseph Smith and put him in context.
Oh, sure. But first, we start with the trigger warning. First thing in the morning, we could be potentially talking about cannibalism, about sexuality, about genocides. I mean, this is what we find in history. This is what we find in our most famous traditional stories. Last week, we talked about Pocahontas,
Right.
which is a Disney romance, or is the story of a young woman who was raped and abused and used as a political pawn. It depends on which story you're telling. And so, in Pocahontas, it's symbolic of that. It's symbolic of colonizers who came to America, Native Americans, Puritans, Protestants from England, who are escaping one thing, let's say, tyranny from one place, and then bringing that tyranny to another group of people.
100%. No, that's a really amazing way to phrase it. Just because, like, from everything I read, right, and in a lot of people's experiences who came to America at this time, they were driven out of Europe. They're driven out of England for usually puritanical religious reasons, but sometimes class reasons, sometimes reasons of overbearing police. Like, we got to remember, right? Like, England was not a nice place at this time. This was it's a noble society. It's a society that's based around classes, and people were treated like pawns. So a lot of the people who come to America at this time are brought there to work, are brought there in semi-slavery, are brought there as religious refugees, the desperate, the hurt, and the broken. And the sad part is that these desperate and hurt, broken people who came here then took out that pain on the people who were already here, you know? And there was also, like, aggravated by the inability to communicate and the misunderstandings of cultural nuance that get ratcheted up to 1,000, right? And it's a wild story. But like you said, extreme trigger warnings for this stuff because, we're talking about the worst of early American history. And early American history is dark. Human beings are brutal,
Oh, yeah. Well, part of it, these people that came here were brought by companies. It's a corporate venture. All these colonies are corporations, from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Virginia Company. They're companies that bring workers. And the church brings their workers, or whatever you call them, and they set up shop. And we talked about the Jamestown colony last time, and how Native Americans are part of this whole story. You can't get rid of the Native American story. This is their land and their mythologies that get incorporated with the settlers. And so next we're going to start with the different Indian today, and to get more into the Indians before we get into this New England history, let's say.
Right. And this is important for the context because we know, like, when we were studying our first 2 episodes of Joseph Smith, he's working directly, his dad is working directly with the natives and clearly states in his journals that he's inspired by them. We know that his uncle, who was teaching at Dartmouth University, was getting a lot of this stuff. And then his personal medical doctor that you were talking about was practicing a form of medicine that was largely based on this combination of native practices with indigenous herbal medicine that was from the Americas, combined with like European understanding of this, you know.
Oh, yeah.
So the native elements are central to this, and also that reaction to the natives. How do these white Europeans deal with this culture? And these people who don't know, like, you got to remember, these people are constructing an entire worldview. Christianity, any religion, is about creating an ideology of everything to try and simplify and structure things. So then when you're confronted with a new culture, a new group that's outside of that purview that wasn't accounted for, now you have to make amends. You have to construct ideas. You have to, why are they here? Why do they have stuff? Why didn't they get talked about by, like, why didn't Christ come talk to them? You know, all of these questions start to arise, and many people have reactions. And people like Smith and these other religious fringe people are coming out of this reaction, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Well, let's hit our first picture.
Okay, there we go.
Here we go. And I'm going to start talking about the word "your pot is boiling," which is a saying. I've heard that in South America. I've heard that in here in North America, a tribal saying, and it deals with the medicine pot, a pot keeper. The spell, the magical spell, begins not when you drink the potion, but when the shaman's picking the herbs for the potion, putting it into the pot and boiling it. You know, today we're going to be talking about Iroquois. And mind you, Iroquois, which means people of the Longhouse, is not their word.
No,
it's a
their
word
word is
assigned to them from someone else. So just mind you, some of the words I'll be using are not the words that people actually use in their own culture. We can go to every culture on the planet, and the word that we've been using, they'll say, "Well, that's not our word. That's just what you call us."
For sure.
So, you know, I'll put that out there.
Yeah, and we're going to use many different terms, you know, in the various tribes around here, you know, because where I live is Algonquin territory, Iroquois territory, or the word that they prefer to use, Haudenosaunee.
Yeah, Haudenosaunee. Yeah, that's the word.
Longhouse. But there are many different tribal groups within the Algonquin and the Haudenosaunee people, right? They were a confederacy, you know, so you have Seneca, you have Ojibwe, you have Mohawk, you have Onaga. It goes on, you know. I'm not familiar with all of them.
Right. And so it's 5 and then it becomes 6.
Right.
And that's what people have to understand. So what we'll be talking about to some people could seem like we're going to put down Native Americans, but because we're going to get into some of the history, which some of it could be bad. But on the other hand, we're going to talk about the first democracy, advanced people. See, everything is not what we're being told, good and bad. And that's what, you know, it's an academic thing. Academics from around the world have written history and made all indigenous people seem very primitive and rustic and violent. And this is true in some of these cases, but they're also advanced people.
Yeah, you get this weird thing with academia because on one hand, for most of anthropology is the newest, I think it's the newest of the social sciences, right? And largely, you know, it practiced, it was a tool of colonialization for a lot of its history. And now it's had this kind of flip where it's doing everything, and this is wonderful, it's doing everything in its power to correct a lot of the injustices, but sometimes that reaction is an overreaction, right? Even though it comes from this place of goodness, like immediately I think of the idea of scalping, right? So when I was first taught this idea about scalping, it was presented to me as a native thing, something the natives did that then the American peoples and the English peoples adopted, right? And then later this narrative changes and they say, no, this was something that was only done by the Americans and the English, and then the natives adopted it as a reaction. But the truth is far more nuanced than that. You know,
everybody been scalping on the whole planet.
Exactly. Stuff is kind of primordial, and this is what I want to get at with something like cannibalism. People, you live in a harsh natural environment, okay, where especially in a place like where I live here, Turtle Island, Canada, you know, where the weather can turn on you. You have to deal with cannibalism. This is a reaction. You're going to have to deal with this stuff, you know? And these cultures are diverse. You know, they're going to have all kinds of different people, all kinds of different medicines. And, you know, and it's once you get into the stories, it becomes really interesting because these stories are they're negative of cannibalism, right? They're not celebratory. They're talking about them in reaction. They're talking about a religious and social political reformation that happens, right?
So that's where we're getting started with your pot is boiling, the myth. Hiawatha, a famous word that people have heard in Indian that people have heard because he's part of bringing peace to these Iroquois tribes who were very violent and had blood feuds.
Yeah,
so they were raiding parties back and forth, just the Hatfields and McCoys. It has nothing to do with Native or any race. It just has to do with humans, back and forth energy, Hatfield and McCoy. What comes around goes around. Till finally, there was the great peacemaker. And mind you, there's always two names for each person. I'm going to say Oneida, which is one of the words, the great peacemaker. And here's Hiawatha. And a Hiawatha is a cannibal, traditionally, a Mohawk cannibal who was adopted into the Mohawk tribe. And one day he's boiling a pot of water. And Oneida climbs on the roof and looks down through a hole. And here Hiawatha sees his reflection in the pot and thinks it's himself. And it's through this, he sees this beautiful image that pacifies him, let's say, because he's a cannibal in the myth. And Oneida comes down and talks to him and charges him with the task of bringing peace to the Iroquois Confederacy. Well, it's not a confederacy, but to the tribes and to unite them, because he's a tough bad boy, and that's what it might take to unite the people together. So it goes back to one tribe, and there's one badass tribe that's not giving in, and the leader does not want to give in. And this leader is famous for, he has snakes in his hair, which is mythology that we talk about a lot. And Hiawatha combs the snakes from his hair, gaining his name, because that's what the name Hiawatha means, he who combs.
Yeah. So because of this is from where I'm around, I'm really familiar with a lot of this. And I went digging into it when you mentioned it to me. So Hiawatha, or in the Ojibwe, Iowantha, he, like you said, was part of the Oneida tribe, and he was a cannibal, is said. And he becomes this peacemaker after being inspired by the other guy, Dequananita. And what happens is he goes to the shaman Adadora. And Adadora is kind of like a notorious shaman. And all of the descriptions of him, he's a giant. Sometimes he's red hair. Usually he has a ginormous penis that's sometimes an actual python. He's described as having, like you said, the snakes in the hair and the snakes on his fingers. What's crazy about the story with him is like, he's the one holdout. He refuses to join the Confederacy and to bring peace and to stop his ways. But once they convince Hiawatha to come, he's able to break this guy down, to eventually convince him to adopt these ways. And they don't just bring Adadora into the Confederacy. They make him the first tribal leader. You know, that's how they get him to join.
Yeah. So it's in these negative stories, people that sometimes go from being the negative aspect of the story can go to becoming a hero in the story. And so that's why I'm trying to explain this. It's not that I'm pro-cannibalist because I'm a vegetarian, but I'm pro-truth and I'm pro-change. And we need to embrace all of our aspects of history in ourselves and don't apologize for nothing, and just embrace the aspects and show how we grew into be these humans in these myths. You know, that's where I'm coming from. Can we hit the next picture?
For sure. And it's pretty cool. Like where I live, there's actually a mountain and a set of falls called Hiawatha Falls.
Oh, yeah. We heard that maybe you might go there and do some live footage for us for upcoming segments. And I know people want to see you on the ground, boots on the ground. Here is a beehive.
Oh.
Beehive. That's one of the words that's referred to these mounds in New England. There's hundreds of them. Some of them are lined to the solstice. They can be filled with water. When the sun comes up on the summer solstice, the sun will reflect down the tunnel there with the light on the water. Some people they're used as root cellars, spiritual reasons, tombs, just like the Great Pyramid. You could come up with any reason you want. They can resonate. Let's say energetics, when you stack stones in certain locations, in certain configurations, you sometimes can get piezoelectric effects, or you can get acoustic effects. So there's a lot going on with this Iroquois land. And this, the Iroquois had armor, like the Roman armor. They had wooden armor. It was very wild. And so the cannibalism thing, I would just like to put that out there. It was ritualized. It wasn't just some half-assed, you go attack somebody and you're hungry. This dealt with warring, and it dealt with attacks, blood feuds. So let's say my brother got killed. I would go attack that tribe and preferably bring the person back. If I can't, we'll bring back a scalp as a fetish, as a keeper, as a marker. But we prefer to bring back that person because we need a placeholder. Because in tribes, there's a certain amount of people, and you have to replace that. Something was taken, and you want to replace that. Sometimes they would adopt the prisoners that they would kidnap and adopt them into the tribe-like family, torture them first, and then sometimes cannibalize them. And they would get mad if you would cry or scream, then they would just kill you.
Yeah, you hear
They
that story.
wanted you to not make sound, and you had to stay tough. And if they respected you for doing that.
Yeah, there's this whole ritual that they would do for like escaped slaves or Europeans who decided to join, which was extraordinarily common when the first people came. And in order to join the tribe, if you were a prisoner or if you freely asked, you had to go through a blue beating where the men would take these canes and would whip you, and if you cried out, you would lose, and they would whip you half to death in some cases.
Oh yeah.
It's super brutal.
And they might adopt you into the tribe after that. And that doesn't mean you're always loyal. Sometimes they escape and go back, or sometimes they're loyal, they marry in. But that was part of what Hiawatha wanted, was to get people intermarried so that they could have peace amongst the tribes, And so with this beehive right here, Joseph would have seen these. The pops would have seen these. Now we're going to get into the treasure hunting with Joseph. Why I put him in there was to show you that they're already associated with treasures and Native American treasures and sacred sites. And we know about the Smith family being into these mounds, and even the Cumorah Hill is posited to be one of these underneath. Right. And they've done science on it. And so this is the environment that Smith and his father knew that there was treasures in. And they're looking for Captain Kidd's treasure, Revolutionary treasure, anything that they could find. Native treasure, and Iroquois treasure at that. And Iroquois shamans. So hit the next picture.
Yeah, just before we move 100% on, I just wanted to add, some of the cool Haudenosaunee magic that we're aware of. You kind of briefly mentioned it, but they have there's all this talk about the stone giants, these tribal warriors who would ingest snake venoms, and they take all these poisons, and they would beat their skins, and they would turn it into armor. And they would wear these wooden armors, but there was more than that. They would transform their bodies through these ritual cuttings and all this stuff. The Smiths almost certainly would have been aware of this. Also, the redheaded shamans who were said to be obsessed with the Amanita muscaria mushrooms, and that the mushrooms turn their hair red.
I asked AI that. I asked AI, and it said that, they use Amanita muscaria. I was like, what? And they also use mushrooms to light fires as comps. They took a chorus, which is sweet flag, calamus, tobacco, mushrooms. You'll see that we got a pic of something that they took coming up too as well. But hit the next pic. Here is one of the stories we didn't talk about last time. I forgot to mention it that's why I wanted to bring it up this time. Is Joseph Smith had got a war party together at a certain point when he was in Ohio to go liberate something, New Zion. So he had a vigilante group, and they were going to liberate. They had a little war party. And halfway there, he in Illinois, he sees a mound. They see a mound. He's like, "Oh shit!" And the other guy's like, "Oh nah, get the shovels out," because once he sees a mound, it's all over. They got to go over there and dig. And so they dig, and they find bones. Supposedly, these are the bones of Zelf. And Zelf is a Lamanite shaman, and he talks about him in some of his books and writings, that Zelf was a white, blonde-haired Lamanite shaman from Israel who came over and was adopted into the Iroquois tribe. And supposedly they found his bones. And they kept his bones, and they were like magic relics.
Wild.
You know, because there's a whole thing of keeping, like we talked about, keeping body parts in bones. Even a guy just got busted recently. I don't know if you heard about the dude that got busted in Kentucky last week with 52 skulls at his house. But he was part of a trafficking network of human body parts. And when the cops showed up and asked him, "Hey, are you here alone? Who's here?" He goes, "Just me and my friends."
Oh my God. So he's a total creep. That just reminded me, because we forgot to mention that there was all those stuff too. Like the Smiths are notorious grave robbers. Like you said, these mounds contain bones. And there was all these accusations about Smith Sr. being a grave robber. And the most famous of which is, after Alvin dies, there are rumors that he dug up the grave, to the point where Smith Sr. actually had a newspaper article published saying that we didn't dig up the grave. We just had to go there and set up shop to ensure that no one else disturbed the grave, because grave robbers are around. And it's wild. But I think a lot of speculation relates that to because Joseph Smith had that prophecy that he had to bring Alvin with him in order to receive the plates. So they did go and steal a bone or hair or something, so they had a piece of Alvin?
At least something. The mountain was hungry. Feed me. Well,
right?
Here's a femur. You know, something. Poor old Alvin. He wasn't really into that stuff. He was the normal working guy that held them, all the cooks together. You know? So the next picture. Let's hit this next picture.
Yeah, poor Alvin.
All right. So there in this area, the Iroquois area, is one of the tribes, Oneida. And that's what the title, now we're getting to the title and explain how this all connects. And
that's where the evil shaman is from. Adadora is from that tribe, apparently, who becomes the best leader eventually. But
and the word means people of the standing stone, because you're talking about those standing stones. And I wanted to find the standing stone of the Oneida stone. And some people posit that that's the actual mother stone right there.
Interesting. Where's this located? Do you know?
This is Oneida territory up by you. This is a couple hour drives from you, you know.
Oh, cool.
And there's more of these for each tribe. So you got to know there's clans within. It's not just Mohawk or Mohegan or, you know, Oneida. There's different clans. Let's hit the next picture and I'll start to break this down. Yes. We have turtle, bear, wolf. And so in Oneida, there's the clan mothers, this matriarchal, the grandmothers and the longhouses pass it down, the lineages. And there's one that's specific, it's Turtle Clan. I wanted to talk about the turtles for you. Got a calendar system. You see the back of the turtle, the discs, the shells, the different segments, the plates. What adds up to 13? We have 13 full moons in a year, then 28 days around. This uses a turtle system as a calendar system in Iroquois shamanism. And it's also close to the Mayan 1320, if you know about that system as well. It's awfully close. And so there's a lot of turtle, let's say you have turtle shamanism, wolf shamanism, bear, and with each one, you get different teachings and different mythologies. And there's turtle mythologies as well. You know, it goes deep. Like we could do a whole episode just the clan mothers, of just the shamanism behind the Iroquois shaman. See, when they came here and thought they were just crazy cannibals and had to convert them or kill them, we got rid of all this magical teachings and of course they don't want to share that stuff with us now.
No.
You know, I understand.
And like around here where I am, like there's all this new information that's been coming forward recently where they found like potentially copper mining around Lake Superior. And they have evidence where I live at Whitefish. Whitefish is like an island on Lake Superior. It's in Bawading territory, which is a tribe of the Ojibwe people. But Bawaning Whitefish Island was super interesting because it was like a massive trading port where people would come from all over North America, to the point where they've even found relics as far as the Aztecs from Mexico in Whitefish, which is crazy. And the population on that island would go from, in the winter months, to like 100, to the French settlers tell us to almost 2,500 people at times during the spring season to catch the fish. So, and from all over, not one tribal group, there was massive trade networks that we don't even know about.
And you did say French, because we'll talk about that later on in your other episodes, and we'll get into the French and British and how that certain tribes that fight with the other, and it's very complicated stuff. But next picture, because we're on a schedule here.
Oh yeah. Also, Turtle Island.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. No, it's coming. Your pot is boiling. Let's say, people are going to know about this. The information's coming out because it's so special. Look, they had something called spruce beer. And they would take spruce and they would ferment it, put honeys in it. They even had heather. You could have your heather honeys, rhododendrons. A lot of things grows in this area that were known in other areas we talk about in other episodes that could be put into their beer. They could have amanita. They could have the hallucinogenic honeys. They could have everything. There's a lot of things going on up in this part of the world right here. We just don't know about that because, of the stuff. But yeah, we got some nice drinks here. Some nice psychoactives. There's a whole plethora of psychoactives in the Iroquois Confederacy, especially when they combined all the clans together, all the knowledge of all the clans together. And then that's when I started asking AI, going through the Native American references, anything it could look at. And there's so much of it. So know in the next episode, it is coming. Definitely. If we can get the next picture.
This is where Sprite comes from, too. Right?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. All right.
You take spruce tips and you put them into some sugar and some water, you'll make a soda. It'll ferment into a beer, but more like a soda than a classic beer.
Wow. That's where Sprite does come from then.
Yeah.
Oh wow. But a Sprite is also like a fairy. What is that when you're liege, you're familiar as well? Right. Okay, so we're talking about Oneida. And Oneida was a tribe, but then Oneida becomes a community and a silverware company and a commune and kind of like a religion. And it deals with Dartmouth. We were talking about Dartmouth before and how the Smiths, a lot of their stuff is coming out of Dartmouth. And now we're going to show the same connection to this whole other commune and a lot of the elements, and it's a holograph of the Smith story. Before we go to the regular Dartmouth that we showed last time, this is UMass Dartmouth in Massachusetts, which was built a little later. But it's very interesting because when I was looking into the architectures of both Dartmouth's campuses, there's an architect, Paul Randolph, a gay architect, mind you, who encoded 666 into Dartmouth campus. This is UMass. Look at that. It's clearly a 666, and the numbers of the steps are 6.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. So, and that's what I was looking at because I started looking into the campuses themselves as entities, just like the Sacred Grove, because it's holding an energy in a space where people are coming together and taking that energy and passing it out. Because we talked about the Dartmouth as a royal charter last time, an English royal charter to spread to the Native Americans. It was if you can go to the next picture, actually.
Wow, that's so cool.
And here's the Sphinx. This is at Dartmouth College, the one we talked about last time, where John Smith. And this was later. The Sphinx Society is a little later in the 1800s, 1880 or something, the secret society, like Skull and Bones. I just want to throw this in there to let you know there is Egyptian secret societies at Dartmouth.
Love it. That's super interesting.
And so we were talking about Dartmouth last time, founded in the 1700s, with their motto is to spread a scream in the wilderness, a cry in the wilderness to the Native Americans as part of this royal charter to pacify and colonize the Native Americans. And they had a preacher there. And the first professor and preacher's name was John Smith, which is the grandfather, cousin of Joseph Smith, that we talk about, that founded Mormonism. And his older brother went to the school there at Dartmouth. If you can hit the next picture. We talked about that in the last episode, how Hiram went there for 4 years while Joseph had a leg infection, and they did surgery on him. And it was the Dartmouth medical professor there that came, and who's Nathan Smith, who wasn't related to them, and worked on him. And a lot of their theology and teachings come from John Smith, their grandfather's cousin, who was wrote the first book in America on unabridged Hebrew, Chaldean studies, Babylonian, Egyptian, all the stuff that Smith talks about. This is where the Hiram and them got it from.
Yeah, they're getting it from
the natives. That was a big part of. They had to spread it to the natives. All the stuff they're talking about, they learned at this college here.
And just so people are clear, Hiram, during that 4 years, while Smith is bedridden, he's bedridden, like he's completely bedridden. So he's teaching him, and this is where they form their super strong friendship, because basically Smith and Hiram are the rock of the church that comes later. You know, there is no church without Hiram, even though Hiram is less of a political aggressor that Smith is. But Smith is than Joseph is. But Hiram is sort of like the brains behind the operation in many ways.
Oh, yeah. So Hiram goes there about 1810 for 4 years, somewhere around there. Well, and like I said, Professor John Smith, his kinfolk, is in charge, the first preacher, the first professor, like in charge of all this stuff and giving all these sermons about this new religions that they're trying to spread. Well, there was another student who went there as well. And that's this gentleman's father, which is John Noyes. And he went there before Hiram. And then he had his son go there after Hiram. And so they were present during John Smith. During that same era, they got the same teachings as Hiram. His dad and the son here and the dad. This is John Humphrey Noyes. And he went there.
They're like an offshoot. They're coming from this. They're drinking from the same cup, even though they're
the same fountain, huh?
And even though they come up with different ideas and different groups, it's from the same. Yeah.
Well-to-do. The father goes on to be, I think that it's the congressman for Vermont. And he goes on to Yale, and after Dartmouth, because he wants to be a preacher after this now. And it's just like Joseph Smith. And he gets kicked out of Yale because one day he claims that he's perfect. He is now a perfect being. I mean, this all sounds so familiar. And it's called perfectionism. He is now perfect. And well, where can he do this at? He has to find a place to do this at, and he goes to Oneida. The Standing Stone, we were talking about the stone Oneida and the tribe there, the Iroquois Confederacy. He goes there and he sets up, let's go to the next picture.
Does he have roots in Puritanism? Because that whole thing, I'm the pure one, that screams of classic New England bullshit.
And his brother had a bank, and he went into the bank and exclaimed that I'm perfect, and that's in Yale. They excommunicated him. Well, he goes and gets a mansion in Oneida, territory there. Because I was like, where does Oneida come from? That's why I talked about all that Indian stuff first, because I was like, because I've heard of Oneida silverware. He starts a silverware company later. And I was like, what's Oneida? How does the Oneida Silverware Company connect to a sex commune that connects to the Native Americans? It's like, what? Okay. That's why we had to do the episode. So he makes his commune, and he invents something a little different. It's a different form of plural marriage. It's called complex marriage. And what it is every person's married to every person. Let's hit the next picture. It will explain it. I had to show you the word. There's the words for it he made. How do you say it?
Pentagamy. Pentagamy or marriage practiced in some communistic societies in which every man is regarded as the husband of every woman and vice versa.
Yeah, everybody's married to everybody. And then everybody could hook up with everybody. And then the elders would pair you together. And more normally it was older women and younger men and older men and younger women and teaching them the ways. And there was at one point about 300 of them. And everyone was getting appointments. And if you formed too much of a bond, then they would separate you and you have to move on to someone else. No, we're talking about John Smith students. Are we talking about Joseph Smith or are we John Humphrey Noyes here? Because there's a lot of similarities once you start to learn about this. Because this is New England. This is this area, these stone mounds.
There are accusations of some Mormons practicing the forms of polyamory, which seem a lot like this, where they were passing around not just wives, but husbands as well,
Yeah. And part of where he got this was what's it called? Fourierism. I don't know if you know about that. It's a French, one of these French authors who talks about phalanges or phalanxes, which are like communes or utopian. This is utopian society. He was trying to build a utopian society where everyone's perfect, but there was eugenic stuff involved, my friend.
It makes me think of also, before we go into that dark stuff, it makes me think of Rabelais and this idea of the Lima, these free love things that come out of the early occultism that we see in France that leads to a lot of this stuff, I think, like Alpheus, that leads to later people like Alpheus Levi, and then eventually to Crowley with his ideas of free love,
Mm-hmm. And mind you, this is all going on simultaneous with Mormonism, like the time frames here. Right. As all those stories we're talking about there, just in another little section, a couple miles over, you got something else going on.
But they were practicing eugenics? So what's going on?
Before we go to the eugenics, let's talk about male continence. He wrote a book about this. Before there was books about Tantra and there was Tantric texts were being translated into English, he told the community that men need to not spill their seed and hold it. It's sacred and pull out. Still have sex, but don't impregnate. And out of the 300 people there, they only made 30 babies. Out over a course of so many years because they controlled it. They wanted to make these perfect babies and you'd match people up like, oh, you two have characteristics together. We'll put you together and it's eugenic. And we'll hit the next picture, which will kind of get into that, which is the dark side of it. There was a word, the breed of special saucer. Yeah. And this is animal husbandry applied to humans. Eugenics.
Oh,
and
wow.
He was into perfectionism. He wanted people to be perfect. And so he saw the other people as inferior.
Yeah.
You didn't see no Iroquois in those pictures.
No. And this whole pure white thing, it screams like a lot of like the weird Mormon stuff that happens after Smith, because that stuff gets even more crazy, right, as time goes on.
And another way that this relates to Mormonism and Deseret and the Iroquois is the bees, because that's what it's all about. Deseret, it's the beehive. Well, his system he called at Oneida was called the bee system. That's why you work together in groups. So like they're called work groups. So it's like, say something needed to be done, like, oh, somebody needs to do apples. Well, groups of people would come together and go do it. And they were called beehives. And it was men and women. It had to be men and women because people would be more happy working together if it's male and female. That's how he saw it. And he invented new clothing for women so they didn't have to have restricted the turn of the century clothing. They wore pantaloons and different.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. There was a lot of positives and a lot of negatives. That's what we see in everything. That's how life is. It's so colorful that you want to eat the full flavor.
Right. That's a good point. Even Joseph Smith, who, I don't have the most positive picture of Joseph Smith, but I am not under the illusion that these people, at least in their own mind, they don't view themselves as monsters, right? They're trying to justify. This is why I really like what that historian Dan Vogel, who describes him as a pious, charlatan, right? Where it's like this belief in the holy lie, the necessity to lie, to the vulnerable, because the ideology is what's important, and creating this moral communal structure is what's important, and whatever it takes to get you to believe is justified, right?
And you know what's ironic? Another parallel, like somebody else, he's arrested.
Oh, wow.
He's arrested for this, for being a prophet, and adultery is the charge.
Of course it is.
Oh, because he liked his women. He are we talking about Joseph Smith?
No, the Noyes,
talking about John Noyes. So, all right. So people come to them and get mad at them over this. That's why they finally have to keep it so private and keep it. And it's all right. Now here I want to pause it. Now, when I'm researching a lot of this stuff, at first I thought wow, it was like Burning Man, having a cuddle puddle, a bunch of sexy people rolling around in a big bed. No, it's not like that. It's not like that in Mormonism and Oneida and perfectionism and a lot of these cults. It's not fun. There's no fun. Sex is you go off alone. You may have 20 wives, but you ain't having a menage a trois. It ain't like it's all playful. It's singular. It's separate. It's not fun. It's uniform. It's compartmentalized.
We'll get into this later in episodes, but I remember I watched that documentary Keeping Sweet on the RLDS Church, and they're talking about the most recent prophet, the one I can't remember his name offhand, but he's the one who gets arrested for abusing. Warren Jeffs. He gets thrown in jail for marrying all those children, and then he maintains the cult from jail. But one of the things that was like a striking point of difference between him and the previous prophets was the group sex and the group shaming. And his wives talk about this, where he'd make them line up and then take off all their clothes, and he'd make them do all kinds of weird stuff. Whereas the previous prophet, I'm sure by our standards, he's not a morally good man, but he was not doing that creepy stuff.
Right. With the individual thing. And like you said, Joseph would go around marrying different women on a daily basis, whereas Noyes, all women in everybody was married to everybody. Don't trip. We're all married to everybody, and we'll all get our turn. Everyone would eventually, you'll hook up with him, we'll hook up with you, we'll all circulate.
It's a different kind of parallel, because with Smith, in the early part of his church, he has this strict man-woman thing that he gets from Rigdon, and they preach that for a long time. And then it starts to, as they start to set up these towns, things start to change, first in Illinois. But then by the time we get to Nauvoo, like you said, there's a period of a couple months where he's marrying a woman a day. And he's traveling around to all of his various followers, and he's marrying other people's wives who he sends off places. He's marrying the people like sisters. He's marrying a mother and a sister. It's like, it racks up to 1,000 with Smith. Do you see anything similar with Noyes? Like how
he had 300 wives. What was the ratio of male to female? I thought it was more women to men. He probably maybe 150 to 200 wives. And they had a long run. He had a long run. He died from coitus or some kind of, rheumatitis, something, or angina. He died from heart stuff at an old age. He had a good run. They did this for 20, 30 years. And till finally.
Did he survive after him, or?
Yeah, they tried to. And what happened was, go to the picture, and I'll explain that now, what happened to them. They formed a joint stock company and started selling silverware. And one of their other products that was bigger than the silverware originally was traps. Remember, we're in trapping territory, Iroquois trapping territory, furs, wampum, trading. This is the trading stuff.
Beaver pelt was all the rage at this time. This fueled all of America, especially Canada at this time.
Well, hopefully we're going to talk about in other episodes, the Beaver Wars.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to this. And so, and they're made all this money internationally doing bear traps and traps to get furry. But silverware is where they made their mark and became so famous. Oneida, that it was in my kitchen growing up. I saw it in one or two of those in the thing. It's a famous brand. I didn't know it came from a sex cult that was set up in Native American land based on Native American with John Smith's weird theology. This is some weird stuff.
What's so interesting about this, Dion, you showing me this is one of the earliest examples of these creepy prophet religious sex cults turning corporate. That's how they often survive. That's how Scientology managed to persist. That's how Mormonism stayed a church, but it also corporatized as well. And really, like the JWs are a corporation as well. Like, that's really been the main focus for a lot of these religious cults in the 20th century. They became these corporate entities. And what's interesting now in modern times is we're seeing a change again, an expansion where these religious people are becoming internet influencers,
Right. You know what's ironic? Charles Taz Russell, 1800s, Pennsylvania, same little area, and supposedly he got charges. His wife sued him too over this. So it's a lot of parallels. When we get into that, you're going to see a lot of parallels. The same little region of these puritanical meeting up against the Native Americans in this new land, and inventing these new religions and going wild with women and setting up corporations. There's more than one. There's definitely more than one. So let's hit the next picture.
Oh yeah, the Wild West was wild, right?
Oh yeah. So here's an ad for Oneida silverware, and it says community on it as well. It's part of the product line. It was attached to marriage gifts. I don't know if you know that with Oneida.
I didn't know it with Oneida specifically, but I did know this about silverware.
Yeah. And
I remember my grandmother's silverware that was gifted to her on her wedding.
Sure, exactly. That's part of how it's passed down, and that's Oneida tradition.
Interesting.
I never knew that. So and that would have been the same thing that the Oneida tribes would have been doing. The Iroquois tribes would be passing down at your marriage, passing down different heirlooms and stuff, in silver or any metals or tools, cooking tools, or shaman. But these are shaman tools. This for the cooking pot. Remember, we were talking about what are you going to use with the Oneida silverware? What would Hiawatha ate in the original times?
Right.
Before he made Sprite. He used to make a stronger little tea there before he got into the Sprite.
Yeah, no, when you showing me some of those descriptions that most of the descriptions we have of the cannibalism comes from French and English, but there's so many of them. And from such a wide span of history, to think that they're all lying doesn't make sense, And then we have the mythical references that survive of cannibalism in the Haudenosaunee stories. So it's almost certain that they're doing it. And, with Hiawatha, like you said, he has a cauldron and he boils people alive. And in a lot of those things that you were sending me, they would talk about that after a war, they would usually keep the head in the hands, and they would turn that into a stew for the elite warriors, and it's similar to what we see in a lot of these other cultures around the world, where people are ingesting the energy of these powerful people, either people who were killed in battle or shamans who die. This is a fairly common practice, and it's not as extreme. It's extreme by our current standards in our current modern society. But if you go back, a few thousand years, it's more commonplace than you think.
Well, so the Mohawk, their own word, which is hard to pronounce, it starts with the K, means people with the flint. But the word that's assigned to them, the Algonquin word, it means man-eaters or flesh eaters. And so so when we say the word Mohawk, that's a different tribe's word, talking about another tribe, meaning that those are the kick-ass ones, because they used to kick their ass. They were famous. That you could look, we can debate cannibalism, but we can't debate the cruelty and violence of warfare.
No.
And they were pretty tough. But there came a point when they set up North America's first democracy. Like we talk about all the Greek forms of democracy and different cultures and history. Theirs came about through a hard blood feud, where finally people came together and And that's how democracy was formed. It became a big family of clans.
Yep.
And that's what we are, all clans, because they call Turtle Island. Some people call all North America Turtle Island. We're all on Turtle Island, and we're all part of a big clan. So we got to, work together.
Yeah, no, that democracy is so beautiful, and there's some really good videos on it. So I don't want to get too deep into it, but it's this, what's really interesting to me is that it was balanced between the sexes, and there were all these mechanisms for peace that were just so interesting. Like you had mentioned, right? The people of the longhouse, the way this would work is that these communities would be built around these longhouses, and you could have many. But in a single longhouse, you could have upwards of 20 families. But usually you would have selected from among the women who lived in this longhouse, you would have the matriarch, the grandmother, who would be chosen. And she would usually the oldest woman or the oldest healthy woman, and she would be in charge of that entire longhouse. And then from the warriors who lived in those families who shared that house, she would select people who would then represent that longhouse at the tribal meetings. And then this would expand. So it would go to the tribal meetings, and the tribal meetings would select representatives that then would go to this massive confederacy where all the 5 tribes would come together. And they have this thing called the moiety, and it's all this balance about which tribe gets to speak at which point. And, but so the men have their own level, the women have their own level of doing things, and the men only get to become leaders if they're selected by the women. And it's a system that lasted for thousands and thousands of years before colonization happened, right? And it still largely persists in many ways today. Like the Algonquin Haudenosaunee people are still one people, even though they're different tribes, right?
The clan mother, and she passes down the teachings of the different animals. And through these animals, you're learning about the mythologies of life, of birth, of death, of healing. There's so much in there. It's like going to a university. People just don't know. They look and it goes right past them. They don't know what's there in nature, what was here in America.
And this is a constant theme that we are seeing throughout all of these episodes, and something I really want to stress, okay? People are generally incredibly intelligent, and all of these various cultures around the world are far more intelligent than we often give them credit for, especially these ancient cultures, Like I was reading this quote, I can't remember who said it the other day, that just struck me super interesting. It's like, it's not that the people in the past wrote literal stories that we then now interpret symbolically. It's that they wrote symbolic stories that we're now stupid enough to interpret literally. Right? There's all of this incredible knowledge that these people had. It's just in a different form, in a different cultural context. And another thing that struck me, I remember I was reading this thing where they were talking about different cultures and how different groups, like if you were to do the Stanford prison experiment today, which is really notorious, right? It wouldn't turn out like it did back then, because this experiment back then was done with almost exclusively middle-class white people, and mostly men, middle-class men, from a very specific American background. We're not all these abusers who are going to just destroy people. Or something like Lord of the Flies, right? All of those kids in that book come from upper class British aristocracy. Now, can you imagine if this was like, a different community, if it was a bunch of young girls who were from a different culture, like a more communal culture like Japan? Would they not, maybe they would survive and not have killed each other on the island. The point is that our perception of these different cultures is extraordinarily biased, and it's extraordinarily derogatory. And it's now a self-fulfilling prophecy, because we've created a system that has oppressed and denigrated these cultures. And then, we look at them and we just see what we want to see. We don't look any different. Don't look any deeper. You just look at that surface level image, It's frustrating.
Well, good. I'm glad that we brought up those frustrations because we're doing this to honor natives. We're doing this to honor
human culture, right?
Yeah, and to explore the deep history in Mormonism, in Oneidaism. He called it perfectionism. You know, we're going to be talking about Charles Taz Russell coming up soon because I know people have been asking for the witness.
We will get to the witnesses, right? We get to all of this. We really love this area right here of this, the hybridization, right? This cultural exchange that happens when the Europeans come to America, you know, and like what we were trying to show with this episode is the other side, the native stuff, and we're going to bring more of that out. But it's all about like Mormonism is a reaction to that situation. And it's reflecting not just on Christianity, not just on Judaism and Egyptology, but also on its native landscape, right?
Yeah.
And it's coming out of this framework of other groups, other cults, you know?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, I don't know if I told anybody to like or subscribe, comments. Definitely. We want to get those. And, you know, you have anything you want to say? Wrap it up.
Just, you know, remember, guys, that these histories are far more deep than we think, and there's so much going on all across the, you know, America, and a lot of this history has been forgotten, and it's worth digging into. There's some interesting stuff, like who would have known that there was a 300-person sex cult that existed for over 30 years, and it's now still persisting as a spoon company.
So, you know, here's what happened. They got a corporate buyout, corporate takeover. Oh, eventually, someone corporate took over their stock. They had to go bankrupt, and they took it over. But it's still going today. Oneida is still on the market, and it just was a corporate takeover. That's just, life is weird.
Life is weird, right? So this cult still survives as a corporation, but not much else, right? You know, and like we'll get into some of the other weirder Mormon stuff at some point, like Beaver Island, you know, and the spending guys. So there's all kinds of weird stuff. And this is what we want to show you. We want to show you guys the less talked about underground kind of history of spirituality and religion that's been obscured. And again, you know, it's not about whether things are true or false, but just an exploration of people's real lived ideas. Because I don't care if it's bullshit. People believe it and are living their lives by it. So who am I to judge at that point, right?
All righty.
But yeah, guys, peace and love. Like, subscribe. You got any last words, Dion?
Just be blessed.
All right. Stay blessed, everyone. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Peace, love, hail Satan.